She was the one nobody wanted. He was the one man who refused to walk away. What happened next changed everything. Red Hollow Valley had a way of breaking people quietly. No fanfare, no mercy, just the slow grind of hard winters and harder judgment. And on the morning of the autumn gathering, when every eligible man in the valley lined up to make his choice, no one gave Tessa Hartwell a second glance. She stood at the edge of the crowd, thick-waisted and scarred, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself because no one else would sell her one without charging double. The whispers started before she even arrived. They always did. If you've ever been told you were the wrong choice, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and let's begin. The autumn gathering in Red Hollow Valley wasn't a pretty thing, no matter how the older women tried to dress it up. They hung lanterns from the posts of the community hall and laid out long tables with dried wildflowers and tin cups of cider that was already going sour by mid-morning. Someone had dragged out a fiddle player from the settlement 3 miles east, a half-deaf old man named Percy, who played the same 4 songs in rotation and occasionally forgot which one he was in the middle of. The dirt outside had been swept into neat lines, then immediately undone by the boots of 24 ranchers who came in from the surrounding hills before the dew had fully dried. It was, by any honest measure, a rough and practical event dressed up in the clothes of something nicer than it was. But nobody said that out loud. In Red Hollow Valley, you learned early not to say things out loud. The gathering happened every autumn, had for 11 years. It started back when the valley was barely a settlement, a dozen families scratched into the hillside, trying to hold on against bad soil and worse weather. Someone, no one remembered who anymore, had decided that the problem wasn't the soil or the weather. The problem was that too many men were trying to work land alone, and alone men made bad decisions, grew bitter, drank too much, and eventually abandoned their stakes. So the gathering began. Women from the surrounding territories, daughters of homesteaders, widows who needed a fresh start, women who'd come west with brothers or fathers and found themselves without direction, would come to Red Hollow for 3 days in October. The ranchers would meet them. Arrangements would be made. It was practical. It was unsentimental. And for 11 years, it had mostly worked. Tessa Hartwell arrived on the second morning of the gathering, which was already a strike against her in the minds of the women who'd come on the first day and had spent the night before the main event calculating their prospects. She came in on the back of a supply wagon sitting among bolts of wool and sacks of dried beans because she hadn't been able to afford the coach from Millhaven, and the wagon driver, a quiet Swede named Arnie, had let her ride for half a day's sewing work. She'd mended 3 shirts and rehemmed a pair of trousers before they cleared the ridge into the valley. By the time she climbed down from the wagon in front of the community hall, her fingers were already sore and her back ached from the bench, and she had a needle prick on her left thumb that was still bleeding slightly through the cloth she'd wrapped around it. She was 26 years old. She was broad-shouldered and thick through the middle in a way that wasn't fashionable and wasn't apologized for, because Tessa Hartwell had stopped apologizing for the shape of her body sometime around her 19th birthday, when she'd realized that no amount of apology was going to change it, and she had other things to spend her energy on. Her hair was dark and heavy, pinned up in a style that had been tidy at dawn and was less so now. There was a scar along the left side of her jaw, pale and slightly raised, running from just below her ear to the edge of her chin. She'd had it since she was 12. Most people's eyes went there first, and then quickly away, the way eyes do when they've seen something they've decided not to ask about. She had a canvas bag with her that held everything she owned worth carrying: a change of dress, her sewing kit, a bone-handled knife her father had given her, a small notebook with a broken clasp, and $11.40 in mixed coin. She stood in front of the community hall for a moment, took in the lanterns and the sour smell of the cider and the sound of Percy playing something that might have been a waltz if you were generous about it, and then she walked inside. The women who had arrived the day before had already sorted themselves into a loose social order, the way women do in any confined space when they've had a night to work with. At the good end of the long table near the front window sat the 3 Calloway sisters from up near the territorial line, tall, fair-haired women with good posture and new dresses, and the particular confidence of people who have been told their whole lives that they are exactly the kind of person other people want to see coming. They weren't unkind, exactly. They just had no reason yet to practice kindness toward Tessa Hartwell. And so they looked at her the way you look at something you haven't yet decided what to make of. Beside them sat a widow named Clara Briggs, perhaps 35, with a boy of about 4 clinging to her skirt and the tired, assessing eyes of someone who has survived enough to no longer be surprised. She gave Tessa a single direct look and a small nod, which Tessa returned. There were others, 7 or 8 women total, ranging from a girl who couldn't have been more than 18 and looked terrified, to an older woman with enormous hands who introduced herself to no one and sat in the corner eating cornbread with quiet efficiency. Tessa took a seat near the middle of the table, not close enough to the Calloway sisters to seem presumptuous, and not far enough away to seem defeated, and she set her canvas bag on the bench beside her and folded her hands on the table and waited. It was Mabel Grouse who said something first. Mabel was the wife of the man who ran the dry goods store and the unofficial keeper of Red Hollow Valley's social ledger, a heavy, important responsibility she took extremely seriously. She had the sharp, telescopic memory of someone who had never once let a piece of gossip go unrecorded, and she had been watching the door since Tessa walked through it. She leaned toward the Calloway sisters with the satisfied expression of someone who has been waiting to deliver news they've been holding carefully. "You know who that is," Mabel said. Not a question. The eldest Calloway sister, whose name was Ruth, looked at Tessa with polite curiosity. "Should I?" "Hartwell girl, from over past Dunmore Creek." Mabel's voice dropped to a volume that was somehow both quieter and more carrying than her normal tone. Her father's farm burned down 3 years ago. Lost everything. Then she went to work for the Kellerman family. Remember the Kellermans? And not 8 months later, Daniel Kellerman fell off his own roof and broke his back. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "She was at the millinery in Dunmore for a season after that," Mabel continued. "Place caught fire. Barely anyone got hurt, thank God, but the building was a total loss." She sat back with the expression of a woman who feels she has made her point. "There's talk, has been for years. Some things just seem to follow certain people." Ruth glanced at Tessa again, more carefully now. "That's just misfortune," she said, but her voice had changed slightly. "People say rational things while their feelings take a different road." "Maybe," Mabel said pleasantly. "Probably." She took a sip of her cider. "I'm just saying what's been said." Tessa had not heard any of this. She was watching the window, where the morning light was coming in gold and thin over the hills, and she was thinking about a dress she'd been commissioned to make before she left Mill Haven, a wedding dress for a woman she barely knew, and whether she should have taken the commission or used the time to come here sooner. She had a habit of arriving at decisions slightly after the window for them had already closed. It was one of several things about herself she was working on. What she did hear, because she was closer than Mabel had calculated, was the tail end of the conversation that rippled out from Mabel's table through the rest of the room over the following hour. She heard it in the way people shifted slightly when she moved near them, in the way the youngest Calloway sister, a sweet-faced girl named Anna, started to smile at her and then seemed to remember something and stopped, in the way the woman with the enormous hands looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity but was close to it. Tessa had been hearing things like this her whole life, and she had learned to recognize the sound of a room that had already decided about her. It had a particular quality to it, a stillness that wasn't quite stillness. She ate her cornbread and drank her cider and said nothing. The men arrived at midday. They came in a loose group, dust on their coats and their hats in their hands because someone had presumably reminded them that this was, despite everything, a social occasion. There were 14 of them, ranging widely in age and condition. Old Harlan Pruitt, who was 60-something and had buried 2 wives already and was looking for someone hardy. The 2 Dibble brothers, who ranched together and were looking, rather optimistically, for a woman who wouldn't mind 2 households with a shared fence. A young man with a sunburned neck named Wade, something who looked like he'd come mostly because his mother had made him. And Colton Reeves. He came in near the back of the group, which was where he generally preferred to be in social situations. He was somewhere around 32, though he looked like he could be younger in good light and older in bad light, the way men do when they've been working outdoors their whole adult lives. He was tall, without being remarkable about it, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair that was growing out past where it was supposed to be, and hands that were permanently roughed from fence work and cold mornings. His coat was clean, his boots were not particularly, He had a straight, unremarkable nose and a jaw that was decent, and the expression of a man who is always doing a quiet calculation behind his eyes about something he hasn't shared with anyone. He ranched alone on a spread, about 4 miles northwest of the valley center, had for 6 years since his older brother Hale moved east with a woman from Cheyenne and left Colton the land and the debt, and the unspoken understanding that Colton was the one who was going to make it work. The ranch was called the Double R, for reasons that had made sense to his father but that Colton had never been entirely clear on. It ran about 300 head of cattle on good years, fewer on bad ones. The past 2 years had been somewhere in between, which meant Colton was not struggling in the way that looks desperate, but was carrying a weight that didn't show unless you knew how to look. He moved through the community halls slowly, not because he was indecisive, but because he was actually looking. Several of the other men made their assessments quickly, with the frank efficiency of people buying horses. Age, constitution, temper, apparent from the set of the face. The Calloway sisters drew the most immediate attention. Ruth had already entered into what appeared to be a serious conversation with a rancher named Aldous Crane, who had the second best spread in the valley, and knew it. Colton drifted toward the window where the light was better, and that was where he first saw Tessa. She was sitting slightly apart from the rest of the women, not by a dramatic distance, but just enough. She had her sewing kit out. She'd pulled it from her bag while the men were filing in, seemingly by reflex rather than intention, and was tightening a loose hinge on the small wooden case with a precision that suggested she did this sort of thing constantly, fixing small things with whatever was at hand. She wasn't performing for the room. She wasn't arranging herself to be seen. She was just sitting there, fixing her kit, and occasionally looking at the window with an expression he couldn't immediately read. He stood there for a moment, watching, which he realized a beat too late was probably strange, and then he looked away. He spoke to 3 or 4 other women over the next hour, doing what you were supposed to do at these events. He asked them the standard questions: where they were from, what they knew of ranch work, whether they had family nearby, and they answered him with varying degrees of frankness and performance, and he listened carefully and said the appropriate things back. But he kept coming back to the window. It was Hector Grouse, Mabel's husband, who found him there near the end of the afternoon. Hector was a decent man who had the misfortune of being married to someone significantly more interested in the world's business than he was, and who had long ago learned to manage this by doing a great deal of nodding and very little of anything else. He stood beside Colton at the window and looked out at the hills with his hands in his pockets. "You settling on anyone?" Hector asked. "Still looking," Colton said. Hector was quiet for a moment. "That woman you keep looking at," he said, with the particular tone of a man who has been sent to say something he didn't necessarily volunteer for. "The one near the end." "What about her?" Hector scratched the back of his neck. "Mabel says there's talk, some history that follows her around." He paused, seeming to search for the most neutral way to convey what was essentially a warning. 3 places she's been connected to have had serious trouble. Fire, accident, that kind of thing. Colton looked at him. "I'm not saying I believe it," Hector added quickly. "I'm just saying what Mabel said." "What's her name?" Hector blinked. That was apparently not the direction he'd expected the conversation to go. "Hartwell. Tessa Hartwell." Colton looked back out the window. "Tell Mabel I appreciate the concern," he said, which was a perfectly polite way of not taking the advice, and Hector recognized it as such and wandered off. He approached her near dusk, when the gathering was beginning to thin and the lanterns were coming on, and Percy had finally settled into something that was recognizably a song, chompang, rather than an approximation of one. He sat down on the bench across from her without asking first, which she registered with a slight tightening of her expression, and then he said, "I'm Colton Reeves. I ranch northwest of here." "I know who you are," Tessa said. "People have been pointing you out since this morning." He was not sure what to make of that, so he said, "What do they say?" She looked at him steadily. She had gray eyes, a shade he didn't have a particular name for, and they were direct in a way that was slightly disconcerting. "That you've got good land and you work it yourself, and you haven't found anyone who could put up with the conditions long enough to make it permanent." She paused. "The women here said it like it was a warning. I took it more as a description." "Fair enough," he said. He picked up the edge of her sewing kit, looked at the way she'd fixed the hinge. It was solid work. "You sew?" I sew for money, she said. I sew because I need to eat. He set the kit down. What else? She looked at him like he'd said something strange. What else what? What else do you do besides sew? She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding something. I keep records well, she said finally. I notice when things are off. Numbers, supplies. I notice patterns. She said it without pride and without apology, just as information. He nodded slowly. My bookkeeping is a disaster, he said. Most ranchers is. My last hired hand left owing me 6 weeks of wages, he said. I didn't notice until it was almost 2 months. That's bad, she said. Yeah. There was a pause. Outside, someone laughed too loudly and then quieted. You know what they're saying about me, Tessa said. Not a question. Hector Grouse told me something. Then you know about the fire and the Kellerman man and all the rest of it. Her voice was flat and even. Every rancher in this room knows. Mabel Grouse has a gift for distribution. I'm not Mabel Grouse. No, she said, but you're going to make a practical decision, and a practical man in your position would look at what I just told you and walk to the other end of the table. She looked at him directly again. I'm telling you this because I'd rather you leave now than after you've decided. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to make a practical argument for the other side. She waited. The Calloway sisters are taken, or close enough, he said. Clara Briggs has a child and will need a man willing to be a father, which I can't promise I'd be good at. The other women here are decent, but I've spoken to most of them, and I haven't had a conversation worth remembering. He paused. You're the first person today who told me something true within 5 minutes of meeting me. Tessa looked at him for a long moment. That's a thin reason, she said. It's better than no reason, he said. She looked back at the window. Outside, the hills had gone dark blue in the last of the light. I'll be honest with you about the other things, she said quietly. The fire at my father's place started from a coal that rolled out of the stove. He was old and not careful. I was 17. I was in the barn when it caught. She paused. Daniel Kellerman climbed onto his roof drunk at 2 a.m. to fix a shutter that wasn't even loose. I was asleep in the hired women's quarters. Another pause. The millinery caught because the owner stored turpentine next to the stove flues and someone knocked it. I helped pull 2 women out before the fire company arrived. She turned back to him. None of it had anything to do with me. But I've learned that it doesn't matter what the truth is if enough people have already agreed on a different story. Colton was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, what? All right. I believe you. She made a small, tired sound. You don't know me well enough to believe me. No, he said, but I know Mabel Grouse well enough to discount her considerably. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to consider it. The formal arrangement was made the next morning, in the dry and practical fashion of Red Hollow Valley business. Colton presented himself to the event's overseer, a humorless man named Fletcher who kept all the paperwork and wrote down Tessa's name in the book. Fletcher looked at it and then looked at Colton with an expression that suggested he had opinions he was professionally required to keep to himself. He stamped the page and handed over the agreement forms. The room had been watching. Ruth Calloway, who had settled her own arrangement with Aldous Crane and was in the comfortable position of someone whose future was secured, leaned toward her sister Anna and said something low that made Anna glance across the room at Tessa with an expression caught somewhere between curiosity and something less kind. Wade, the sunburned young man, said, out loud and to no one in particular, Reeves picked the Hartwell woman, Lord. Old Harlan Pruitt shook his head slowly, which was his entire comment. Mabel Grouse did not say anything at all, which was somehow worse. Tessa heard it all the way she always heard things in rooms that had decided about her. In the shift of the air, the altered quality of the silence. She was standing beside Colton at the overseer's table, and she kept her eyes on the paperwork, and her face showed nothing. When they walked out of the hall together into the cold morning air, she stopped on the steps and turned to him. You understand what you just did in there, she said. I made an arrangement, he said, same as everyone else. You gave them something to talk about for the next decade. He looked out over the valley, the dry hills and the pale sky, and the smoke rising from the chimneys of the settlement below. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's their business. This is mine." Tessa studied the side of his face. He wasn't performing certainty, she decided. He wasn't doing the thing men sometimes did where they made a dramatic gesture and then expected gratitude for it. He looked like a man who had weighed something and reached a conclusion and was not particularly interested in revisiting it. She looked out at the valley too. "I want to tell you something before we get any further into this," she said. "All right. I've been told my whole life that I'm more trouble than I'm worth." She said it without bitterness, as a factual statement. "I've been told it in polite ways and impolite ways in ways that weren't even words. And what I found is that there are two kinds of people who say it." She paused. "The ones who are wrong about me, and the ones who are right about themselves." He was quiet. "I can work," she said. "I'm not delicate and I'm not romantic about ranch life. I'll keep your books, and I'll sow what needs sowing, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will be wrong sometimes too, and I'll tell you that also." She looked at him directly. "But I will not spend every day proving I deserve to be here. I did that for 3 years in Dunmore Creek, and it nearly ground me down to nothing. I won't do it again." Colton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't need you to prove anything. I need someone who can tell me when my numbers are off." He met her eyes. "And I'd rather have honest trouble than comfortable agreement." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, short and clean. It was not a warm beginning. It was not a romantic one. But it was, she thought, an honest one. And in Red Hollow Valley, on the raw edge of the frontier where everything cost more than you expected and very little came for free, honest was the thing that lasted. They walked down the steps together and out into the cold morning, and neither of them looked back at the hall. The ride to the Double R took the better part of a morning. Colton drove the wagon himself with a gray horse named Patch, who had opinions about hills and communicated them at length. The road northwest out of the valley was rough and in several places barely a road at all, more a suggestion left by previous wagons in the grass and hardpan. The hills on either side were dry and yellow-brown in the October cold, with a few scrub pines clinging to the ridgelines like they'd decided to stay out of stubbornness rather than optimism. Tessa sat on the wagon bench with her canvas bag on her knees and watched the landscape. She didn't make conversation for the first hour, which Colton seemed to find acceptable. He drove and occasionally spoke to Patch in a matter-of-fact way that didn't expect a response and received none. It was Tessa who eventually spoke. "How many hands do you run?" she asked. "2 right now," he said. "Had 4 last spring. Lost one to a silver claim down in Nevada, one quit without a word, one got hurt and went back to his family." He paused. "The 2 I've got now are solid. Brothers named Dix and Emmett Farrow. They don't talk much, but they work." "Animals?" 312 cattle, as of last count, which was August, so the numbers moved since then. He glanced at her. "That's the kind of thing I need tracked properly." "I'll need a ledger." "There's one. It's a mess." "I assumed." She looked back at the hills. "What's your water situation?" He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Good question. There's a creek that runs reliable 9 months of the year and unreliable the other 3. I've been meaning to sink a second well on the south pasture for 2 years. "What stopped you?" "Cost. Time." He paused. "Mostly cost." She nodded, said nothing more for a while. The Double R came into view from the top of the last ridge, a cluster of buildings in a shallow valley between 2 long hills, with the main house and a barn and several outbuildings arranged in the practical way of someone who built things to work rather than to be looked at. A smoke column rose from the house. The fencing was visible in long brown lines across the near pasture, and even from this distance Tessa could see a section of it that was listing badly to one side. "Bottom rails down on the east fence," she said. Colton looked. "Yeah, Emmett was supposed to fix that 3 days ago." His jaw tightened slightly. "Is he reliable?" "Usually." He frowned at the fence. "Usually." Tessa filed this away without comment. Is it? The house was better than she'd been bracing herself for, which was the most honest thing she could say about it. It was not large. 4 rooms, with a main area that served as kitchen and sitting space combined, a bedroom, a small back room that held supplies and smelled of lard and old leather, and a room off the north side that had been used for storage and was currently occupied entirely by broken equipment in various states of attempted repair. The floors were wood plank, uneven in places but intact. The stove was big and appeared functional. The windows were small but whole. It was dusty. It was sparse. There were 3 dishes, 1 pot, and a skillet that had been seasoned so many times it had the color of iron ore. There was a shelf with 4 books on it, their spines cracked and faded. There was a single chair by the stove and a table with 2 chairs pulled up to it and a bench along the far wall that might have been comfortable for someone shorter. Dix and Emmett Farrow were in the yard when they arrived. They were in their middle 20s, dark-haired, with the kind of faces that look similar enough to suggest relation without being identical. They looked at Tessa with the blank, assessing expression of men who have learned to form opinions slowly. "This is Tessa Hartwell," Colton said. "She'll be keeping the books and managing the house." Dix nodded. Emmett nodded. Neither of them said anything. "East fence," Colton said to Emmett. Emmett looked at the ground briefly. "I'll get to it this afternoon." "You said that Monday." "I'll get to it today," Emmett said. Colton went inside with the bags. Tessa stayed in the yard for a moment, looking at the 2 brothers. "I'm not here to make things difficult for you," she said. Dix looked at her with calm, dark eyes. "Didn't say you were. No one in the valley will say it to your face either," she said. "But there'll be talk. It's already started. I just want you to know that what they say about me, the fires and the accidents, none of it is what they say it is." The 2 brothers looked at each other briefly. One of those exchanges that passes between people who know each other well enough to communicate in less than words. "We work for Mr. Reeves," Dick said finally. "Not for Red Hollow." It was a short statement. It was also, she thought, as much of a welcome as she was going to get, and it was more than she'd expected. She nodded and went inside. That first week was a kind of assessment, though neither of them named it that. Tessa took the ledger from the shelf where it had been shoved between a tack catalog and a section of broken harness, and she sat at the table for most of 2 evenings working through it. It was, as Colton had said, a mess. Not malicious, just the mess of a man who recorded things in good faith, but inconsistently, who sometimes wrote in the margins of other entries, who occasionally used the last pages as scrap paper for calculating fence post spacing. She worked through it from the beginning, reordering, cross-referencing, flagging the gaps. She found $17 she was fairly sure hadn't been properly accounted for. She found a month in the spring of the previous year where supply costs were roughly double what they'd been the month before and the month after, with no explanation she could immediately identify. She flagged that too. $17, she said to Colton on the 3rd evening, pushing the ledger across the table to him. He looked at it. Where was it? 3 different supplier payments logged twice. It's an easy mistake in messy books. She pulled the ledger back. The bigger question is March of last year. Your supply costs were $42 over what they should have been based on your winter stock and your consumption rate. Do you know what you bought that month? He frowned. He thought about it. I had a man named Casper Doyle working then. He handled most of the supply runs. Where is he now? Quit, end of March. He looked at her. You think he was skimming? I think the numbers are $42 wrong in a month he was running errands for you, she said. What you think it means is up to you. Colton was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, I don't have a way to prove it now. No, but you know to watch for it. She turned back to the ledger. I'll have a full picture for you by the end of the week. He watched her turn back to the columns of numbers with a focused, slightly ferocious attention, her pen moving in small, careful marks. He thought about Hector Grouse warning him away from her. He thought about old Harlan Pruitt shaking his head. He thought that he had made, possibly, a reasonable decision. Done. The first incident came 11 days after Tessa arrived. She woke before dawn because she woke before dawn most mornings. An old habit from years of needing to get work done before the world had demands on her. And she went to the stove to build up the fire. The kitchen was cold in a way that felt wrong for the time of night, and she stood there for a moment trying to understand why. Then she realized. The smell, not fire, not smoke. Something chemical, faintly sharp, coming from the direction of the yard. She put on her coat over her nightdress and went to the door and opened it. The barn smell was wrong. She crossed the yard in the dark, moving fast, and pushed open the barn door, and what she found was the feed supply. 3 weeks of grain for the cattle, $60-odd worth of oats and mixed grain stored in the big wooden bins along the back wall, soaked through with what turned out to be a bucket of creek water that had somehow tipped or been tipped onto the bins from the loft above. Wet grain in a sealed barn in October didn't spontaneously combust, but it would mold inside a week and be worthless inside too. She stood in the dark barn with a lantern and looked at the tipped bucket lying on the loft boards above her and tried to think clearly. Buckets didn't tip themselves. She woke Colton. He came out in the dark, looked at the mess, and spent several seconds not saying anything. "You think someone did this?" he said. "The bucket was at the back of the loft," she said. "I've been up there twice since I arrived. I remember it because it seemed like an odd place to leave it." She paused. "Could it have moved on its own?" He looked at the loft. Wind doesn't reach the loft unless the big doors are open. They weren't. "No," she said. They weren't. They stood there as the dark barn with the smell of wet grain heavy around them. Outside, the first gray of morning was beginning to show at the seam of the hills. "Could be nothing," he said. Not like he believed it. Like he was being careful. "Could be," she said. She pulled her coat tighter. "We should move what we can salvage to the dry store. And I'd like to know who was in the barn yesterday afternoon." He looked at her. "Dix and Emmett," she said. "Did anyone else come through?" "There was a man from the Aldous Crane spread," he said slowly. "Dropped off a message about the community fence repair. He came by in the afternoon." He paused. "I let him water his horse. He was in the yard maybe 10 minutes. "Near the barn?" Colton's jaw tightened. "I'm not accusing anyone," Tessa said. "I'm asking what you know." He looked at the ruined grain for another moment. Then he said, "Let's move the salvageable stock." They worked for 2 hours in the cold dark, she and Colton and the Farrow brothers hauling what could be saved to the dry store. They didn't speak much. The work was cold and messy, and the smell of wet grain was deeply unpleasant. And by the time the sun was properly up, Tessa's arms ached and her hands were cold through, and she had grain dust worked into the crack on her thumb that had finally stopped bleeding. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the stove with the cup in both hands and tried to arrange what she knew into something with a shape. Feed ruined. East fence damaged. Supply records off by $42. A hired hand who left in March with no warning. She thought about patterns. She'd always been good at patterns. Her mother had said it was a curse. "You see the thread in everything, Tessa, and half the time there isn't one." But her mother had also died of a fever because she hadn't noticed that the town's water source had been contaminated for 3 weeks before anyone thought to look. Maybe there was no thread. Maybe it was a wet October and an old bucket and a man who ran a sloppy ledger. She drank her coffee and kept thinking. Through the window, she could see Colton standing in the yard looking at the hills to the north. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low, and he stood very still for a long time, the way a man stands when he is trying to see something he doesn't have enough information yet to make out clearly. She watched him and thought, we're both looking at the same thing from different distances. That, more than anything so far, felt like the beginning of something. On the 12th day, the first of the valley's neighbors came to call. It was Aldous Crane himself, which was notable. Aldous Crane did not generally make social calls. He had the best ranch in the valley and the bearing of a man who expected the world to come to him, which it generally did. He rode up on a big black gelding and dismounted with the smooth ease of a large man who was comfortable in his body, and he shook Colton's hand in the yard with the particular warmth of a man who needs something. Tessa watched from the kitchen window. "Word in the valley," she could hear Aldous saying. She cracked the window slightly. It was a thing she'd learned, that women who listened from windows were called sneaky, and women who didn't listen to anything were called foolish. "About your choice at the gathering," Aldous was saying. "Colton, you know I've got no quarrel with you personally. You've been a good neighbor, but there are men who are talking." "Let them," Colton said. Aldous paused. He wasn't a man used to short answers. "You know what's said about that woman." "I know what Mabel Grouse says." Aldous looked out over the yard, his eyes moving over the barn, the outbuildings. His expression was difficult to read. "You had trouble with your feed stock recently." Colton was very still. "Where did you hear that?" Aldous spread his hands. Valley talks. Point is, men are going to see that kind of thing and connect it, whether it's fair or not. Is that a warning? It's a statement of fact. Aldous looked back at him with an expression that might have been genuine concern or might have been something else arranged to look like it. Some of the men at the eastern end of the valley are talking about approaching Fletcher about the community arrangement, whether certain people should be permitted to, if any man has business with me, he can come say it to my face, Colton said. His voice had gone very flat, the particular flatness of someone choosing precision over volume. I'd thank you not to carry messages that weren't sent. Aldous looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and nodded once. You're a stubborn man, Colton. I'm an informed one, Colton said. Appreciate you stopping by. He watched until Aldous and the black gelding were back up the ridge road and out of sight. Then he turned and walked to the house. Tessa was at the table when he came in, the ledger open in front of her, her pen in her hand. She looked up. What did he want? She asked. Colton pulled the other chair out and sat down heavily. He ran a hand through his hair. To tell me the valley is talking. I heard. She set her pen down. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm not sorry for me, she said. I've heard worse. I'm sorry you're in it. He looked at her across the table. I knew what I was walking into. Knowing it and living it are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Did you notice anything about his eyes when he was looking at the yard? She thought about the window, the angle of Aldous' gaze. He was looking at the barn specifically, she said, and the south fencing. Colton nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I noticed that too. They looked at each other across the table in the thin autumn light. Tell me what you know about Aldous Crane, Tessa said. Colton leaned back in the chair and said, Let me think about where to start. Outside, the wind came down from the northern hills and moved across the dry grass of the pasture, and the fence posts leaned slightly in it, and the double R sat in its hollow between the hills and waited for what was coming. It was coming. She could feel it the way she felt patterns, not yet visible, but already there, already laid into the structure of things by someone who had been planning for longer than anyone had noticed. She picked up her pen. She started a new page in the ledger. At the top, in her careful, precise hand, she wrote, Things that don't add up. And she began to list them. The list on the new ledger page grew slowly, the way a bruise develops. Not all at once, but spreading, darkening, until you couldn't ignore the shape of it anymore. By the end of the third week at the double R, Tessa had 7 entries. By the end of the fourth, she had 11. She didn't share all of them with Colton right away, partly because she wasn't certain enough yet, and partly because she'd learned early in life that presenting half-formed suspicions to people who weren't already looking for them generally accomplished nothing except making you look unstable. She'd been called unstable before. She had no interest in earning it. The entries were small things, individually. A section of the north fence that had been repaired in September and was already coming apart again, in a way that looked less like poor work and more like something had been worked loose from the outside. 2 cattle missing from the far pasture. Colton logged it as strays, which happened. But when Emmett rode the perimeter, he found no gap in the fence they could have pushed through. A supplier in Millhaven who sent a delivery short by 2 sacks of salt, and when Tessa wrote to query it, replied that the manifest showed full delivery and that the signature on receipt was Colton's. Colton had not signed for that delivery. He'd been mending the creek bank all morning and hadn't left the property. Someone had signed his name. She put that one in the ledger with a double mark beside it, which was her notation for this one, matters most. It was a Tuesday in early November when the first worker quit. His name was Burl, and he'd come on 2 weeks after Tessa arrived, hired to help with the late-season fence repairs that Emmett hadn't finished, and wasn't going to finish alone before the ground froze. He was a quiet man, mid-40s, who worked steadily and ate his meals without complaint and had never said a single word to Tessa, either positive or negative. She had appreciated the neutrality. He found Colton in the barn on a Tuesday morning and said he was leaving. That was it. No explanation that amounted to anything. He said something about a cousin who needed help south of the territory, which had the texture of a reason that had been assembled quickly rather than grown naturally. Colton let him go without argument because that was how Colton handled most things. He didn't press when pressing would only embarrass both parties. But that evening, after supper, he sat at the table with his coffee going cold and said, "Burl talked to someone in town Saturday." Tessa looked up from the ledger. "Who?" "Don't know. Emmett saw him outside the feed store talking to a man he didn't recognize. Big man, well-dressed for the valley." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Emmett said the man handed Burl something, folded paper, maybe money. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove ticking in the cold. "You think someone paid him to leave?" Tessa said. "I think it's possible." "Why would someone want your hired hands gone?" Colton looked at her steadily. "A ranch with 2 men and a bad winter coming is a ranch under pressure," he said. "A ranch under pressure makes mistakes, makes bad decisions." She turned that over. "Or accepts a bad offer," she said. "Yeah." She looked back at the ledger, at the double-marked entry about the forged receipt, at the missing cattle, at the fence that had come apart in a way she still couldn't quite explain to herself as natural. She thought about Aldous Crane standing in the yard with his eyes moving over the barn and the south fencing, and the way he'd said word in the valley like he was delivering a verdict that had already been reached somewhere she hadn't been invited. "Tell me something," she said. "Your land, the Double R, where does it sit relative to Crane's spread?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "Between him and the creek watershed," he said slowly. "Why? If you sold the Double R, or were forced to sell it, who benefits most from the water access?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. "Aldous Crane," Colton said. "And who else ranches that northwest corridor?" "The Pruitt family, Old Harlan, and the Dibble brothers." "How are their operations?" Colton rubbed his jaw. "Harlan's been struggling. His oldest boy left last spring. He's running on old labor and a lot of stubbornness. The Dibbles are—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "They sold. I heard last week. Didn't think much of it. Who bought their land?" He looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't ask." She turned to a clean page in the ledger. "Find out," she said. He watched her start writing. After a moment he said, "You're not afraid of any of this." It wasn't quite a question. She thought about answering it honestly, which took a beat longer than agreeing would have. "I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said. "Being afraid doesn't mean you stop looking." But November came down hard on the valley, the way it did some years, not gradually, with the season giving you time to prepare, but all at once, a week of sharp cold that froze the ground and put ice on the creek shallows and made every morning's work twice as difficult as the one before. The cattle moved closer to the barn. Dix and Emmett worked steadily through it, their breath showing in the cold air, their pace unchanged. Tessa had come to appreciate them in the way you appreciate reliable things. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of settled trust. The valley, meanwhile, did not settle. Mabel Grouse's network operated in all weather, and over the first 2 weeks of November, 3 things happened in Red Hollow that Tessa heard about in the particular way she heard most things, indirectly, in the spaces between what people said to Colton's face. The first was that 2 of the valley's merchants had begun charging the Double R higher rates on supplies. It wasn't dramatic, $1 more here, a surcharge for delivery there, but it was consistent, and it was new. When Colton went into Hector Grouse's dry goods store and asked about the change in the tallow pricing, Hector looked at his counter and said it was a general increase for the season, which was a lie so transparent it was almost polite. The second thing was that a woman named Ida Pruitt, Harlan's wife, stopped Tessa in the road near the South Pasture Gate one gray morning when Tessa had gone out to check the fence line herself. Ida was 60 and weathered and had the kind of directness that comes from having said enough polite things to last a lifetime. "I want you to know," Ida said without preamble, "that I don't hold with what Mabel says." Tessa looked at her. "What does Mabel say this week?" Ida's mouth pressed together briefly. "That Reeves is going to lose the ranch by spring, that it's your doing." She paused. "And that the decent thing for the valley would be for him to send you away before you pull him under entirely." Tessa stood in the cold road and felt the familiar settling in of that particular kind of statement, the ones that dress up cruelty as concern. She'd heard them enough times that they no longer hit the same place they used to. They'd moved from the chest to somewhere lower and less vital. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I'm not telling you to be kind," Ida said bluntly. I'm telling you because Harlan's been approached about his land twice in the last month, both times by men he doesn't know. Men who said they were representing a development interest out of the territorial capital. She looked at Tessa steadily. He didn't sell, but he's thinking about it. Tessa was very still. What kind of development interest? Agricultural consolidation, they called it. Ida said it the way someone says a phrase they've memorized because it didn't make sense to them, but seemed important. Said they were buying parcels all through the Northwest Corridor, assembling a large holding. Agricultural consolidation, the Northwest Corridor. The double R sitting directly between Crane's Spread and the Creek watershed. Thank you, Ida, Tessa said. Ida looked at her for a moment more, some assessment running behind her eyes. You're not what I expected, she said, which was not quite a compliment, but was close enough. Then she turned and walked back up the road toward the Pruitt property, her coat pulled tight against the cold. The third thing that happened in November was that someone cut the water line from the creek feeder to the south pasture trough. This was not ambiguous. This was not a rusted fitting or a frost crack. The line had been cut cleanly, with a blade, at the point where it crossed under the access road. Colton found it on a Thursday morning when he went to check the trough levels and found them dry. He followed the line back and crouched over the clean cut in the cold mud and stayed there for a long moment without saying anything. When he came inside, his expression had a quality to it that Tessa had not seen before. Not anger exactly, but something underneath anger, something colder and more considered. It was cut, he said. I know, she said. She'd seen him come back across the yard. She'd read it in the way he was moving. He sat down at the table. He didn't take his coat off. This isn't bad luck, he said. No. Someone is doing this deliberately. Yes. She opened the ledger to the page with the double-marked entries. She put it in front of him. All 11 points laid out in her neat, careful hand. The fence, the grain, the missing cattle, the forged receipt, the water line. Beside each entry, dates and any corroborating details she'd been able to gather. He read through it without speaking. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How long have you been tracking this? He said. Since the second week, she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't immediately name. You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure enough. She met his eyes. I'm sure now. He looked back at the list. The forged receipt. That's a crime. Yes, if we can prove it. How do we prove it? I've already written to the supplier, she said. Ask them to send over a copy of the signed manifest. When it arrives, we compare the signature to yours. She paused. But I don't think the supplier is involved. I think someone intercepted the delivery, signed for it, pocketed the difference, and waited to see if anyone noticed. Casper Doyle, Colton said. Possibly. But Doyle left in March, and this receipt is from October. She folded her hands on the table. Someone active, someone who still has access to your supply routes. Colton was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves in a low, continuous sound. Aldous Crane, he said. He has motive, she said carefully, and the means to hire men who don't get noticed, but I don't have proof. Then we get proof. It's not simple, she said. If we go to Fletcher or the Territorial Authority with a list of suspicious events and a theory about a neighbor, they'll do nothing. We need something harder than patterns. She looked at him. I need you to trust me to keep building the case. He looked at her across the table for a moment. I trust you, he said. She didn't let herself react to that in any visible way, which took a small effort. There's one more thing, she said. She pulled the ledger back and turned to the last entry, the one she'd added that morning before he found the water line. I've been going over the Valley Land records, the ones filed with the county seat. Emmett rode out to get copies last week. I didn't know about that. I asked him not to say anything until I was sure what I was reading. She turned the ledger to face him. 3 properties in the Northwest Corridor have transferred in the past 8 months. The Dibble brothers' place, a small homestead north of the Pruitt line that belonged to a widow named Cassie Farrell, and a parcel your father sold off in 1871 that borders your east fence. Colton stared at the page. The Farrell place? Cassie sold? In September. The buyer is listed as a land company registered out of the territorial capital. She put her finger on the name she'd copied from the record. Redstone Agricultural Holdings. The name meant nothing to her. She watched to see if it meant something to him. His expression changed in a way that was subtle but real. Redstone, he said. You know it? I've heard it. He was quiet, working something back. There was a man at the Valley meeting last spring. Fletcher introduced him as a land agent from the capital, said he was just observing, interested in the region's growth. He paused. His name was Redstone, Marcus Redstone. Tessa looked at him. He sat next to Aldous Crane the whole meeting, Colton said. They didn't introduce themselves to each other. They didn't need to. He looked at the ledger page, at the careful handwriting, at the shape of the thing she'd been building. They already knew each other. Yes, she said. I think they did. The room was very quiet for a moment. If they've already bought 3 parcels in the corridor, Colton said slowly, and they're driving pressure on the rest, your land, Harlan Pruitt's land, mine, they're assembling a consolidated holding, Tessa said. A large enough block of land to control the watershed. Once they have the water rights, every ranch in the valley is at their mercy. She paused. It's a clean play. You don't need to steal the land if you can make the owners desperate enough to sell cheap. Colton sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, How do we stop it? She had been thinking about this. She'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks, running it the way she ran figures, from multiple directions, looking for the place where things came together. We need someone inside it, she said, or something that connects Crane to Redstone in a way that can be shown to the county authority. If we can prove the sabotage is coordinated, that it's not bad luck or poor management, but a deliberate campaign, then we have something. She looked at him. But we have to be careful. If they know we're building a case, the sabotage will stop, and we'll have nothing but a theory. So we keep it quiet. For now. She closed the ledger. And we stop losing workers. He rubbed the back of his neck. I can't match what they're paying men to leave. You don't have to pay them more, she said. You have to give them a reason the money can't replace. She thought of Dix and Emmett, their quiet steadiness. Some men stay when they're asked to stay, when they know what they're staying for. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're thinking about talking to Dix and Emmett. I'm thinking you should talk to them, she said. It should come from you. But yes. He looked at her steadily. You've been running all of this alone, he said. For 3 weeks. Someone had to. Tessa, I'm not saying that to reproach you, she said, with a patience she genuinely felt rather than performed. I'm saying it because that's how I work. I gather before I speak. She met his eyes. But I'm speaking now, and I need you in it with me. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, just a small realignment. He nodded. Once, clean, the same way she'd nodded at the gathering steps all those weeks ago. All right, he said. She pulled a fresh page from the back of the ledger, where she'd been leaving blanks for new sections. Then let's talk about what we do next, she said. Outside, the November wind pushed through the valley without mercy, and the cattle stood in close formations in the frozen pasture, and somewhere on the ridge road that ran toward Crane's spread, a rider moved through the early dark at a pace that suggested purpose rather than travel. Tessa did not see him, but she had written his existence into the ledger 3 days ago, in a category she'd titled What We Haven't Seen Yet. She had a feeling they were running out of time before that column filled itself in. The manifest copy arrived from the Millhaven supplier on a Wednesday, folded inside a plain envelope that Tessa had been checking the post for every morning for 2 weeks. She opened it at the kitchen table before Colton was up, smoothing it flat against the wood with her palm. The supplier had included a note, brief, professionally neutral, saying they were happy to cooperate with any inquiry and that the signature on file matched the one provided at delivery. She set the note aside and looked at the manifest itself, at the line at the bottom where the recipient's signature had been written. It was close. Whoever had done it had looked at Colton's name in the ledger or on some other document and practiced. The C was right. The R was right. But the way the letters connected was wrong. Too neat, slightly slanted where Colton's natural hand ran level. She'd spent enough time with his handwriting over 6 weeks to know the difference. She put it in the back of the ledger with a double mark and waited for him to come down. When she showed him, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "That's not my hand." "No." "Who had access to my signature on documents they could have copied from?" She'd thought about this. The community meeting minutes. Fletcher keeps them, but they're open record. Anyone can request a copy. She paused. And your feed account at Hector Grouse's store. Hector keeps signed receipts. Colton looked up from the manifest. Something passed through his expression. Hector, he said. Not an accusation, just a name being placed somewhere new and uncomfortable. He has access to your signature, she said carefully. That's all I know. Hector Grouse wouldn't... He stopped, restarted. He's not a bad man. Bad men are rarer than people think, Tessa said. Men who do bad things because they're scared or in debt or because someone with more power than them made it seem like the easier choice, those are everywhere. She looked at him steadily. I'm not saying Hector is running this. I'm saying someone used something he had access to. Colton pushed back from the table and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the frozen yard. December had come in on the heels of November without much change, except that the cold had gone from sharp to settled. The kind that stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like the permanent condition of the world. I'm going to talk to him, Colton said. Not yet, Tessa said. He turned. If Hector is involved, even peripherally, even just as someone who looked away when he should have looked, and you confront him now, word gets back to Crane within a day. She kept her voice even. We're not ready. Then when are we ready? It was a fair question, and she didn't have a clean answer for it, which she said so. Soon. I'm waiting on one more thing. She'd written 3 weeks ago to a contact she had in the territorial capital, a woman she'd sewn for briefly in Millhaven who worked as a secretary in the county land registrar's office. She'd asked the woman, carefully and without explaining everything, to look into the ownership chain behind Redstone Agricultural Holdings. When I know who's actually behind Redstone, we have something we can take to the county authority. Colton looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and went to put on his coat for the morning work, and Tessa turned back to the ledger, and the day proceeded the way days on a working ranch proceed, in a series of cold physical tasks that don't care what you're thinking about while you do them. Except, it was Dix who first used the word organized. He said it in the barn, 3 days before everything broke open, while he and Colton were working on the water line repair, and Tessa had come out to check on the progress. They'd been talking about the missing cattle. 2 more had been found outside the south fence that morning, on the wrong side of a barrier that showed no gap. And Dix had stopped working and looked at the fence line for a moment and said quietly, "This is organized." Nobody responded immediately. "I've seen range disputes," Dix said. He was not a man who spoke at length, so when he did, people listened. "I've seen neighbors who cut each other's fences out of meanness. I've seen men let their stock wander into somebody else's grass on purpose." He paused. "This isn't any of that. This is a plan. Somebody's running a plan against this ranch." "Yeah," Colton said. Dix looked at him. "You've known." For a while, Emmett, who had been working steadily on the line fitting without appearing to participate in the conversation, said, without looking up, "Who?" "We have a theory," Tessa said. "We don't have proof." Emmett straightened up and wiped his hands on his trousers. He and Dix exchanged the brief wordless communication they were always exchanging. Then Emmett said, "What do you need from us?" It was exactly what Tessa had told Colton he would say, or something like it, and she felt no satisfaction in being right. Just a small settling relief that the people around her were turning out to be who she'd assessed them as. "I need your eyes," she said. "Both of you. Anyone who comes onto the property that isn't regular. Anyone on the Ridge Road who doesn't have business being there. I need to know." She looked between them. "And I need you to say nothing to anyone in the valley about what you've seen or what we're doing. Not in the feed store, not at the community post, nothing." Dix looked at her steadily. "You think someone in the valley is feeding information back?" "I think it's possible." She paused. "The incidents on this ranch happen at intervals that suggest someone knows our routines. When Colton's away. When the barn is empty. When supply deliveries are expected." Emmett said, "Burl." They all looked at him. "Burl knew the schedule," Emmett said simply. "Before he left, he knew when deliveries came in, when you rode the south pasture." He shrugged, the gesture of someone stating an obvious thing they assume everyone already sees. "Could have passed it along." Tessa made a note. The letter from the territorial capital came on a Friday afternoon, 4 days into December. Tessa read it twice at the table before she said anything to anyone. Redstone Agricultural Holdings was registered in September of the previous year, more than 14 months ago, which was a full 5 months before any of the land purchases in the Northwest Corridor and a full year before the first incident at the Double R. The registration listed 2 principals. The first was a man named Marcus Redstone, which they already knew. The second was a silent partner whose name was listed in the secondary filing, a document her contact had to dig for specifically. Aldous Crane, not a theory, a fact, in the county record. She sat with it for a moment. This thing she'd been building toward for weeks now arrived and solid and heavier than she'd expected. She found Colton in the barn. She showed him the letter. He read it standing up in the gray afternoon light coming through the barn door. She watched his face, the slow, controlled way the information moved through him, the tightening along his jaw, the long exhale that followed. 14 months, he said. At least. Possibly longer before the official registration. He was planning this before last winter. He looked at the letter again. Before the gathering, before you came here. He paused. The man he sent to the gathering to drop off the message. He was looking at the barn. Assessing, she said. He handed the letter back. His hand was very steady, which she recognized as the kind of steadiness that costs something to maintain. This goes to the county authority. It does. But I want to have everything together when it does. The manifests, the land records, the letter. A complete picture. She folded the letter carefully. If we go with pieces, they'll pick it apart. If we go with everything at once, it's much harder to dismiss. How long? A week, maybe less. She looked at him. Can you hold it together for a week? He looked out at the pasture, the cattle moving slowly through the frozen grass, his land running out to the ridge in the cold gray afternoon. Yeah, he said, I can hold it. He was wrong about the week. They had 4 days. Down. It started with the wind. The storm came down from the north on a Tuesday night with very little warning. The sky went from the usual flat gray to a specific greenish black that anyone who'd lived through a plains storm recognized as serious. And the wind came in the hour before dark with a force that rattled the house windows and sent the cattle moving restlessly toward the barn. Tessa and Emmett worked to get them secured while Colton and Dix rode the fence line to check for breaches before full dark made it impossible. By 9 o'clock, the storm was fully upon them. The wind was continuous and violent, driving particles of ice horizontally across the yard, and the temperature had dropped fast enough that the water bucket inside the door had a skim of ice on it by midnight. Tessa sat up with the stove, feeding it steadily, and listened to the wind work at the roof and walls and tried to calculate what the morning's damage would be. She was not asleep when she smelled the smoke. It came under the door first, just a thread of it, and she thought for a moment it was from the stove, a chimney-back draft in the storm wind. She adjusted the flue damper, and the thread continued and then thickened slightly, and she understood in the space of one breath that it was not the stove. She went to the window. She could not see much through the storm and the dark, but she could see the orange. It was the east pasture, the dry grass that hadn't been grazed through, the section that backed up against the Dibble property line, which was now Redstone property. It was burning in a line that was moving west toward the cattle shelters and the barn, pushed by the storm wind. She did not waste time on the question of how it started. She pulled on her coat and boots and took the lantern and went across the yard at a run, fighting the wind, into the barn. She woke Dix and Emmett, who slept in the barn quarters through winter, with 4 words. East pasture, fire, now. Then she ran to the house and pounded on Colton's door. He came out already half awake, the wind had been keeping him light, and she told him in 2 sentences, and he was dressed and outside in under a minute, and the 4 of them began the brutal work of moving cattle in a storm with a fire coming from the east. It was not organized. It was loud and dark, and the cattle were panicked, and the wind made everything harder. The lanterns kept guttering, the animals kept moving wrong, and the fire was not moving slowly. Tessa worked the near pen gate while Emmett drove the cattle through, and she could see the orange line growing, feel the heat arriving ahead of itself on the wind. It was Dix who found the man. He'd gone wide around the east side of the barn to check the back fence, the fence that bordered the old Dibble property, and he came back at a run, which was not a thing Dix did under normal circumstances. "There's a man," he said to Tessa, breathing hard. "In the east tree line. He's got something with him. A can." She grabbed his arm. "Where exactly?" "Northeast corner, near the old property post." She looked across the yard to where Colton was working the far cattle pen. She made a decision in under a second, the way you make decisions when there isn't time to be uncertain about them. "Keep moving the cattle," she said to Dix. "Don't stop." She picked up the lantern. He grabbed her arm. "Don't. Keep moving the cattle," she said again, and pulled free, and went toward the northeast corner of the property at a pace that was just short of running, because running with a lantern in this wind would put it out, and she needed the light. The tree line was a thin strip of cottonwoods along the old property border, bare now in December, their branches thrashing in the storm. She moved along the fence line with the lantern held low, scanning the ground, and she found what Dix had seen, boot prints in the frozen mud near the corner post, and a smell above the smoke smell, the sharp, flat smell of coal oil. A can, tipped on its side in the grass just outside the fence line. She picked up the can. Still had weight in it, not empty. And then she heard someone moving in the cottonwoods to her left. She went still. She held the lantern up and pushed through the fence gap at the corner post and into the thin tree line, and the storm wind was loud enough that she was almost on him before either of them saw the other. He was a large man, not young, in a heavy coat that was good quality for a man doing this kind of work. He was moving fast through the trees toward the Redstone property, toward what used to be the Dibble place. He hadn't heard her coming in the wind. She said nothing. She looked at him in the lantern light, his face. She wanted his face. And he turned at the light and froze for one suspended second, and she had enough time to see him clearly. Broad face, dark beard with gray in it, a scar across the bridge of his nose that made him look like he'd had it broken more than once. A man she'd never seen in Red Hollow Valley, in the weeks she'd been here. But around his neck, on a cord, was a stamped metal tag. She'd seen tags like it before. Supplier identification, the kind that wholesalers used for their contracted delivery men. The tag said R.A.G. Holdings. He turned and ran. She did not chase him. She was not built for chasing large men through frozen tree lines in the dark. And she knew it, and she had what she needed. She watched him go, marked his direction, and turned back toward the fire. They saved most of the barn. They lost 2 cattle to smoke, and the east shelter was gone entirely by the time the fire burned itself out against the bare dirt of the creek bank in the early morning hours, the storm having finally shifted the wind north and slowed the spread. The east pasture grass was destroyed, 100 yards of it, black and smoking in the gray dawn. The smell was dense and acrid and would be there for days. The 4 of them stood in the yard as the light came up, covered in soot and exhausted past the point where exhaustion has a particular feeling. Colton looked at the damage. His face showed nothing specific, just the controlled blankness of a man in the immediate aftermath of something bad, before the full calculation of it arrives. Tessa said, "I saw him." Everyone looked at her. Everyone. She described him. The coat, the build, the broken nose, the cord around his neck. She described the coal oil can. She described the tag. "Redstone Agricultural Holdings," Colton said. "On the man who set the fire on your land," she said, "in the middle of a storm that would make it look like an accident." She looked at him steadily, soot on her face and her coat smelling of smoke and her voice completely level. "That's not a theory anymore." Colton looked at the burned pasture for a moment. Then he turned to Dix. "You saw the man." "I saw a man," Dix said. "I can say I saw someone with a can near the fence line in the northeast corner." "That's enough," Tessa said. "Combined with the manifest, combined with the land records and the letter, combined with the tag." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "We have enough." Emmett was looking at the burned grass. He said without turning around, "Crane thought the fire would finish you." "He thought the storm would cover it," Colton said. "And if we were dealing with the fire, we wouldn't notice the man who set it." "He didn't know about me," Tessa said quietly. Not with pride, just as a fact. "He's been watching the ranch, but he doesn't account for me. None of them do." She thought about Mabel Grouse and her whisper network, about Aldous Crane standing in the yard looking at the barn, about the 14 months of planning that had been running underneath the surface of the valley's ordinary life. That's been their mistake from the beginning. Colton looked at her. He was tired and dirty, and his ranch had a burnt scar across its east pasture and 2 cattle dead, and his expression in that particular gray morning light held something she'd never seen in it before. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than that. "I need to ride to the county seat," he said. "Today." "Yes," she said. "Take the ledger. Take the manifest copy. Take the letter." She paused. "Take Dix as witness." He nodded. He looked at the burned land one more time, then looked away from it. "Can you and Emmett hold things here?" "We've been holding things here," she said. It came out with more edge than she intended, and she saw the corner of his mouth move slightly, set not quite a smile, but close enough. "Yeah," he said, "you have." He went inside to clean up and prepare for the ride, and Tessa stayed in the yard a moment longer, looking at the black-streaked pasture, at the smoke still rising thin from the remains of the east shelter. The cold was severe, and the sky was the blank white of a spent storm, and the valley below the ridge was just beginning to show its first smoke columns from morning fires. She thought about the man with the cord around his neck running through the cottonwoods. She thought about Aldous Crane in his house 4 miles away, perhaps already knowing the fire had happened, waiting to hear how much damage had been done. She thought, "You watched this ranch for a year and never once looked at the woman you decided didn't matter." She went inside to start the morning fire. Colton and Dix rode out before 8 in the morning, the ledger and the documents wrapped in oilcloth and packed in the saddlebag. And Tessa watched them go from the yard until the ridge road took them out of sight. Then she turned back to the ranch and did what needed doing. There was a great deal that needed doing. The east shelter had to be assessed for what could be salvaged before the cold worked further into the damaged timber. The cattle that had been moved in the night needed water and feed, and the normal morning rotation had been completely disrupted, which meant Emmett had to manage work that usually took 4 people with only himself and Tessa. She was not experienced with cattle the way he was, but she was not useless either, and she followed his lead without pretending otherwise, which seemed to be the right approach because Emmett directed her without apology and she listened without resentment, and they got through the morning's work by midday. In the afternoon, while Emmett repaired the gate the panicked cattle had damaged in the night, Tessa sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a full account of everything. Not for the county authority Colton had the ledger for that, but for herself, in the careful sequential way she organized information when she needed to be certain she hadn't missed anything. The man in the cottonwoods, the tag, the direction he'd run, the coal oil can, which she'd brought inside and set on the back shelf as physical evidence, the smell of it still faintly present in the kitchen. She was on her 3rd page when she heard a horse in the yard. She went to the window before she went to the door, which was a habit she'd developed over the past several weeks without consciously deciding to. It was not a habit she'd had before coming to the Double R. She thought about that occasionally, how a place or a situation could quietly reshape the way you moved through the world. The writer was Ida Pruitt. Tessa opened the door. Ida was dismounting with the stiff efficiency of a woman whose knees had logged more miles than they were comfortable with, and she looked up at Tessa with an expression that was more complicated than her usual directness. "I heard about the fire," Ida said. She tied her horse to the post and came up to the door without being invited, which Tessa took as a sign of something. "How bad?" "East shelter is gone. 2 cattle, the pasture grass on the east side." Tessa stepped back to let her in. "Could have been worse." Ida came inside and looked at the kitchen with the assessing eyes of a woman who has run her own house for 40 years and cannot help evaluating other people's. Whatever she made of what she saw, she kept it to herself. She sat down at the table without being asked. "There's talk in the valley," she said. Tessa put the kettle on. "There's always talk in the valley." "Different talk this time." Ida folded her hands on the table. She had large, heavily worked hands, the kind that tell you everything about a person's life without them saying a word. "Mabel Grouse is saying the fire is proof that you're what she always said you were." She paused. "But there are others who aren't so sure anymore." Tessa turned from the stove. "What changed?" "The storm was bad all across the valley. Nobody else had fires." Ida looked at her steadily. "Natural fires start from lightning, from accident. A fire that hits one property in one specific location during a storm that hits everyone. People are starting to ask questions." She paused again. "And Harlan got another visit. Yesterday morning. Different man this time, better dressed. offered him 40% below what the land is worth. He said no? He said he needed time to think. Ida's jaw tightened, which is Harlan for yes if he doesn't get a reason to say no soon. The kettle began to heat. Tessa turned back to it, thinking. Colton was at the county seat with everything she'd built over 6 weeks. The manifests, the records, the letter. It was enough. She believed it was enough. But the county seat was a day's ride, and the county authority would need time to review, and in the meantime, Harlan Pruitt was sitting in his house deciding whether to sell his family's land to the men who had set fire to his neighbor's pasture. Tell Harlan to wait, Tessa said. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from Ida. Tell him specifically to wait until Colton comes back from the county seat. Tell him Colton has information that directly concerns his property and his decision. Ida looked at her. What kind of information? The kind that explains why a well-dressed man is offering him 40% below value. She held Ida's gaze. And why Aldous Crane hasn't made any supply runs to Millhaven in 4 months, but his operation shows no sign of running short. Something shifted in Ida's expression. Crane, she said. I can't tell you more than that until Colton is back, Tessa said, but I need Harlan to hold. Ida was quiet for a moment, her hands around the cup. You've been building something, she said. Yes. How long? Since the 2nd week. Ida looked at her with an expression Tessa couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't quite respect, wasn't quite apology, was somewhere between the two in territory that didn't have a clean name. Mabel's going to look like a fool, she said finally. I'm not interested in Mabel looking like anything, Tessa said. I'm interested in the ranches in this valley staying in the hands of the people who built them. Ida drank her tea. She didn't say anything for a moment, and Tessa didn't fill the silence, and the kitchen held the comfortable quiet of 2 women who understood each other well enough not to need to talk constantly. I'll tell Harlan, Ida said finally. She stood, set down the cup, pulled her coat straight. You're a different thing than what they said you were. Most people are, Tessa said. Ida almost smiled. It was a near thing. Then she went out to her horse and rode back down the ridge road, and Tessa stood in the doorway, watching her go, and thought about Harlan Pruitt in his cold house, and hoped it would be enough. Colton came back late the following afternoon, earlier than she'd expected. She heard the horse on the ridge road and was at the door before he'd dismounted, and she read his face immediately. Not the controlled blankness of the day he'd left, but something that had moved, that had broken through in one direction or another. She couldn't tell which direction yet. He came inside, took off his coat, sat down at the table. He looked tired in the specific way of a man who has held himself together through something difficult and is now allowing himself to stop holding. They took it, he said. She sat down across from him. All of it? They went through every piece, the manifest, the land records, the letter, the coal oil can. I went back to get it before I left. He looked at her. Your account of the man in the tree line, your description of the tag, and the county sheriff is a man named Artis Webb. He rubbed his face with both hands. I've met him twice before. Solid man, not easy to impress. He went through the ledger page by page. He paused. He said it was the most organized presentation of evidence he'd received in 11 years of office. Tessa said nothing. He's sending men to the Redstone property and to Crane's spread today, Colton continued. He's also contacting the territorial authority about the land company registration because 2 of the purchases may have involved fraudulent representations to the sellers. He looked at the table. Cassie Farrell, the widow. She may have been told something about the land's water rights that wasn't true. She was deceived into selling. Possibly. Webb's going to look at it. He was quiet for a moment. He also wants to speak to you directly. He wants your testimony about the man in the cottonwoods. When? He'll come here. He didn't want you riding to the county seat alone, given what's happened. He glanced at her briefly. His words. She sat with that for a moment. The small, practical consideration of a man she'd never met, arranging things so she didn't have to travel alone in a situation someone had made dangerous. It was a minor thing. It landed somewhere anyway. What about Crane? She asked. Colton's expression moved. Webb went to his property this morning before I left the county seat. I waited for word. He paused. Crane was home. Webb spoke to him directly. His jaw tightened. He denied everything, said the land company was a legitimate investment, said the sabotage claims were baseless, said he'd never heard of the man with the broken nose. Of course he did. But the man with this broken nose was found. Colton looked up. Webb had a deputy asking around at the way stations between here and the territorial capital. Man matching your description was seen at the Clearwater station the morning after the fire, heading southeast. Deputy tracked him to a boarding house in Dunmore Creek. He paused. His name is Roy Belcher. He's a hired man. Webb knows him. He's been connected to 2 other property disputes in the territory over the past 3 years. Never charged. Never had anyone who could identify him with evidence. Until now, Tessa said. Until now. Colton looked at her steadily. Belcher had the cord in his coat pocket. Still had the tag on it. He paused. He's in county custody. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Tessa became aware that her hands, folded on the table, were not quite steady. She pressed them flat against the wood and waited for it to pass. It took a moment. It's not finished, Colton said. He was watching her. Crane's lawyer is already involved. This will take time. County proceedings, the territorial authority, the land company investigation. It won't be over in a week. I know, she said, and in the meantime the Valley still talks. The Valley will always talk, she said. That's not the same as being wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Webb asked me about you, how I came to have someone keeping records and building evidence over 6 weeks without the people doing the damage noticing. He looked at her with a directness she'd come to recognize as the particular way he expressed things he found difficult to say casually. I told him you were the smartest person on my property. She looked back at him. What did he say? He said he could tell from the ledger. She let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, I need to tell you something. All right. When I was in the cottonwoods, when I saw that man. She paused, choosing the words with the same care she chose everything. I was frightened. I want you to know that. I'm telling you because I've let you think I'm steadier than I am. And that's not honest, and I said at the beginning I'd be honest with you. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated. I've been frightened since the 2nd week, she said, since I started understanding the shape of what was happening here. I kept building the ledger because stopping felt worse than continuing, but I was frightened doing it. She looked up at him. I'm not fearless. I just don't let it make my decisions. Colton looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know. You know? I've been watching you for 6 weeks, he said simply. I can tell when something costs you something, even when you don't show it. He paused. That's not weakness, that's just being a person. She looked at him across the table in the thin December light. This man she'd told at a community gathering that she was the wrong choice, who had listened to that and made his own assessment and declined to agree with her. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone, not the version of you that rumor had constructed, not the version you performed for safety, but the actual thing underneath. It was uncomfortable. It was also, she found something she hadn't realized she'd been without for a very long time. Ida Pruitt came yesterday, she said, because she needed to move the conversation to solid ground before something in her expression gave too much away. She told him about Harlan and the 40% offer and what she'd told Ida to tell him. You bought us time, Colton said. I bought Harlan time, she corrected. It's his decision. I'll ride to the Pruitt place tomorrow morning. Tell him what Webb has. He thought for a moment. He needs to hear it from me directly. Yes, she said. Take the letter. He nodded. Sheriff Webb arrived at the Double R 2 days later with a deputy and the methodical patience of a man who has interviewed enough witnesses to know that rushing them produces worse information than waiting does. He was older than Tessa had pictured, somewhere in his late 50s, with a heavy gray mustache and quiet eyes that moved over everything carefully and settled on nothing in particular, the way experienced observers' eyes do when they're taking in everything at once. He shook her hand when they were introduced, which was not something all men did with women in formal situations, and he looked at the coal oil can she'd kept on the back shelf, and he asked her to walk him through what she'd seen in the cottonwoods starting from the moment she smelled the smoke. She told it straight, without embellishment. She told it the same way she'd written it, in sequence, With the details she was certain of separated clearly from the things she'd inferred. Webb listened without interrupting, which was another thing she appreciated. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. How close had she been to the man? How long had the light been on his face? And was she certain about the tag? She answered all 3 without hedging. Webb looked at his deputy, then back at her. You've given me more usable testimony in 10 minutes than most witnesses provide in an hour, he said. I've been building toward this conversation for 6 weeks, she said. I wanted to be ready for it. Webb's mustache moved in a way that might have been a suppressed expression. I understand you also compiled the documentary evidence. The ledger, yes, and identified the connection between Crane and Redstone from county land records. Yes. He looked at her for a moment, not the assessing look she was used to from people in the valley, the kind that was measuring her against a rumor, but a different kind, more like the look you give something you're trying to accurately appraise. What did you do before you came to Red Hollow, Miss Hartwell? Seamstress work, she said. Bookkeeping for small operations when I could get it. Anything that needed careful attention to detail. You've wasted considerable talent on small operations, he said, which was the closest to a direct compliment as his manner seemed to allow. He gathered his notes and stood. I'll need you available if this goes to a territorial hearing. Given Crane's lawyer, it likely will. I'll be here, she said. Webb and his deputy spent another hour at the property, walking the east fence line, photographing the damage, taking Dix's statement about the man he'd seen near the northeast corner. Then they rode out, and the Double R went quiet again in the cold December afternoon. It was Hector Grouse who came forward on his own. Tessa had not expected that. She'd thought if Hector was involved, that the involvement would have to be pulled out through formal proceedings. She had underestimated the weight that guilt puts on a man who is fundamentally decent and has done something that he knew was wrong at the time he did it. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, without Mabel, which was itself significant. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and asked to speak to Colton, and Colton brought him into the kitchen, and Tessa started to leave, and Hector said, No, she should hear this too. He sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, A man came to the store in August, said he was from a land company, said he was doing due diligence on ranch operations in the Northwest Corridor and needed to verify supply records for several properties, including the Double R. He paused. He had official-looking papers. He was very convincing. You gave him access to Colton's receipts, Tessa said. Hector looked at her. I let him look at the file. I was standing right there. He paused. He didn't take anything. I thought he was just reading. His hands tightened on the hat brim. I didn't understand until the fire. That's when I put it together, what he'd been doing while I was standing there. Copying the signature, Colton said. Hector nodded. He looked miserable and genuine and old in a way he hadn't looked before. I didn't know what they were doing, he said. I want you to know that. If I'd known, I believe you, Colton said. And because he was Colton, he said it the way he said things that were true, without additional softening or additional edge. Hector looked at Tessa. Mabel doesn't know I'm here, he said. She's still... He stopped. She's not a bad woman. She just doesn't change her mind about people easily. She doesn't need to change her mind, Tessa said. That's her business. Hector nodded, swallowed. I'd like to make a statement to Webb, he said. Formal statement. About the man who came to the store. I can describe him in detail. He paused. I think it was Belcher, the man they've got in custody. Then you should call on Webb, Colton said. He'll want to hear it. Hector stood, put his hat back on. He looked at Tessa one more time with an expression that was trying to be several things at once and not quite managing any of them cleanly. I'm sorry, he said, for what it's worth, for what was said. She looked at him for a moment. An apology from Hector Grouse for what Mabel Grouse said was a complicated kind of accounting, and they both knew it. But he'd come here on his own, and he was going to give a statement that would help close the case, and that was worth something. Tell Webb everything you remember, she said. That's what matters now. He nodded and went out. The yard was quiet after he left. Colton stood at the window and watched Hector's wagon move down the ridge road, and Tessa stood at the table with her hands on the back of the chair and felt the strange, deflating sensation of something that has been held under great pressure for a long time beginning, finally, to release. The formal charges against Aldous Crane and Marcus Redstone came through from the Territorial Authority 11 days later: fraud, criminal conspiracy, and arson. Roy Belcher, facing a much longer list and a much smaller ability to pay lawyers, had already provided a detailed account of who had hired him, what he'd been paid to do, and the 3 previous properties where he'd done similar work for Redstone Holdings. It was the kind of account that didn't leave much room for an alternative interpretation. Crane's lawyer was capable and expensive. The proceedings would run into the following year, but the immediate effect was visible within a week. The pressure on the remaining Northwest Corridor ranches stopped. No more well-dressed strangers with below-value offers. No more damaged fences. No more missing cattle. No more supply chain irregularities. The Double R ran its December operations in a cold but uninterrupted quiet that felt, after everything, almost startling. Tessa sat at the kitchen table one evening in the 3rd week of December, the ledger closed for the first time in 2 months, and looked at the lamp flame and thought about the shape of the past 12 weeks. She thought about the community hall in October, the bench near the middle of the table, Percy playing his rotation of 4 songs. She thought about what she'd told Colton on the gathering steps. "I will not spend every day proving I deserve to be here." She hadn't. She'd spent it doing the work instead, which it turned out was the same thing done differently. Colton came in from the barn, cold air coming in with him, and hung his coat on the peg. He looked at her at the table with the closed ledger and the lamp. "All right," he said. She thought about the question, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about things she wanted to answer accurately. "Yes," she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it without qualification. He nodded. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee, and stood there for a moment in the warm kitchen while the cold night pressed against the windows, and neither of them said anything. And the quiet between them had the specific quality that takes time to build and cannot be manufactured, of 2 people who have been through something real together and come out the other side of it still standing. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in its rough and practical and entirely unromantic way, the shape of something that might last. January came in without ceremony. The territorial hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of the new year, and in the days before it, Red Hollow Valley had the particular quality of a place holding its breath. Not the anxious, gossiping breath of the autumn gathering, but something quieter and less certain of itself. People who had spoken loudly in November were speaking less in January. The arithmetic of the situation was too clear to argue with. 3 properties in the Northwest Corridor had been purchased through a company that was now facing fraud charges. A hired man was in county custody and had already given testimony implicating his employers in arson and deliberate sabotage. And the woman everyone had blamed for the Double R's troubles had, by most accounts, been the one who identified and documented the scheme, while the rest of the valley was busy repeating Mabel Grouse's opinions about her. That kind of arithmetic has a way of making people quiet. Tessa noticed the quiet, but did not particularly trust it. She'd lived long enough to know that silence from people who've made up their minds about you rarely means they've changed those minds. It usually means they're waiting to see which way things finally fall before they commit to a new position. She didn't resent it. It was just how people worked, and she'd rather understand how people worked than be surprised by it. What she was not prepared for was Ruth Calloway. Ruth came to the Double R on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of January, 2 days before the hearing, riding a good bay mare and wearing a coat that was better quality than anything else in the valley. She came alone, without her sisters, which was notable enough that Tessa mentioned it to Colton when she saw the rider on the Ridge Road. "Ruth Calloway," she said, at the window. Colton looked up from the harness he was mending at the table. "What does she want?" "I have no idea." "Should I?" "No," Tessa said. "I'll talk to her." She went out to the yard. Ruth dismounted with easy grace and stood in the cold morning light with her reins in her hand, looking at Tessa with an expression that had none of the arch assessment of the gathering and considerably more complexity. "I won't take much of your time," Ruth said. "All right." Ruth looked out at the pasture, the east side, where the grass was still black-streaked under a thin layer of January frost. "My husband rode out there the morning after the fire," she said. "Aldous' spread. He wanted to look at the fencing along our shared boundary." She paused. "He found something." Tessa waited. "Boot prints," Ruth said. several of them, and the impression of a can set down in the mud. On the Crane side of our boundary fence, 30 yards from the Double R property line. She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He made a sketch, with measurements. He didn't know what he was looking at then. She held the paper out. He knows now. Tessa took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a competent hand-drawn diagram with measurements noted in clean numbers. The position of the prints relative to the fence post, the dimensions of the can impression in the frozen ground. She looked at Ruth. Aldis's lawyer has been telling people the arson charge won't hold, Ruth said, that there's no physical evidence placing any of his men on the Double R property. Her voice was flat and factual, the voice of a woman delivering information she has organized carefully. My husband's sketch places Belcher on the Crane side of our fence, which is adjacent to the northeast corner of your property. Combined with your testimony from the tree line, it closes the gap, Tessa said. Yes. Tessa looked at the sketch again. She thought about the territorial hearing, about Webb's organized case, and the holes Crane's lawyer was already probing. This diagram, placed in the record alongside her own eyewitness account, would make the physical trail complete. Why? Tessa asked. Not suspiciously, just directly. Ruth looked at her. Because Aldis Crane was willing to burn your barn and ruin your land and drive you and your husband off your property for the sake of a water corridor, she said. And my husband shares a fence line with him. She paused. And because what was said about you at the gathering was carried further than it needed to be, and some of it came from my table. It was not an elaborate apology. It did not ask for anything in return. Tessa respected both of those qualities. You should bring the sketch to Webb directly, Tessa said, before the hearing. He needs it from your husband as a witness, not through me. Ruth nodded. We're riding to the county seat this afternoon. Good. Tessa refolded the paper and handed it back. Thank you. Ruth took it, tucked it back in her coat. She looked at Tessa one more time with that complicated expression that had replaced the old assessing one. You're not what I thought you were, she said. It was almost exactly what Ida Pruitt had said in November, and it landed slightly differently the second time. Not because the words were different, but because Tessa was. I know, she said, but I was always this. The information was just somewhere else. Ruth looked at her for a moment and something shifted. The last of whatever social calculation had been running behind her eyes, resolving into something simpler and cleaner. She nodded once, mounted her horse, and rode back down the ridge road. Tessa stood in the yard until she was out of sight. The cold was sharp, and the sky was the low white of a January that hadn't decided yet whether to snow. She stood there and thought about the sketch in Ruth Calloway's coat, and about the hearing in 2 days, and about the long, specific chain of decisions and observations and cold mornings that had led from a community hall bench in October to this yard in January. She went inside and started the accounts for the week. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make legal proceedings dramatic. It was long. It was technical in places. Crane's lawyer was skilled and expensive and did the things skilled, expensive lawyers do. He questioned the chain of custody on the coal oil can. He questioned the reliability of Tessa's identification in the dark and the storm. He produced a counter-narrative about legitimate land investment and the natural misfortunes of ranch operations. He was working against a tide. Belcher's testimony had been detailed and specific in the way only a man trying to reduce his own sentence can be. Hector Grouse's statement about the man who had accessed Colton's supply receipts matched the description of a known Redstone associate. The sketch from Ruth's husband established physical presence on adjacent property during the storm. And Tessa's testimony, which she delivered in the same flat, sequential way she'd used with Webb, starting from the smell under the door and ending with the tag on the cord, was, according to Webb afterward, the clearest account of a witnessed event he'd heard in a formal proceeding in years. She didn't perform. She didn't dramatize. She simply told what she had seen and what she had concluded and how she had reached each conclusion, and when Crane's lawyer pressed her on the darkness and the storm conditions, she said, I was close enough to see the cord around his neck and read the tag on it. If you'd like to test the visibility at that distance with a lantern in those conditions, I'll describe the methodology I used and you can replicate it. The lawyer did not pursue that line further. Aldous Crane sat through 2 days of proceedings with the rigid stillness of a man who has spent his life being formidable and is discovering that formidability has a sharper edge when turned outward than when it comes back. He looked at Tessa once during her testimony, a long, cold look that she met and held for a count of 3 before turning back to the hearing officer. She was not trying to prove anything with the 3 seconds. She simply was not willing to look away. The outcome came on the afternoon of the second day. Criminal conspiracy and fraud charges upheld against both Crane and Redstone. The arson charge against Crane, supported by Belcher's testimony and the physical evidence chain, was referred to the territorial court for a full criminal trial, which would come in the spring. The 3 land purchases made through Redstone Holdings, the Dibble property, the Farrell homestead, the parcel bordering the Double R's east fence, were placed under investigation for fraudulent misrepresentation and referred to the County Land Authority for potential reversal. Cassie Farrell, the widow who had sold her homestead in September, was sitting in the gallery when the referral was announced. She made a sound, quiet, involuntary, that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something in between. The sound of someone who has been carrying a wrong decision and has just been told it might not have been entirely theirs to carry. Tessa heard it from 2 rows ahead and did not turn around. Colton was quiet on the ride home, not the closed quiet of someone processing badly, but the deeper quiet of a man letting something settle that has been unsettled for a long time. The countryside around them was white and still in the late afternoon. The snow had finally come, 2 inches of it, lying flat and clean over the hills and the road. Patch moved through it steadily, his breath showing in regular plumes. After about 20 minutes, Colton said, "It's not finished." "No," she said. "The criminal trial is spring. The land reversals will take longer. Crane's still a neighbor until then. He won't be doing anything to anyone's property while he's facing criminal charges," she said. His lawyer made sure he understood that. He nodded slowly. "Harlan Pruitt's land is safe. For now, and if the Dibble sale is reversed, there'll be legitimate buyers willing to pay fair value." She paused. "That's a year's work, probably, but it's moving the right direction." He drove for a while in silence. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the east pasture. The burned section, the black streaked grass currently buried under 2 inches of January snow. What about it? Spring regrowth will be strong," he said. "Burned ground comes back, usually better than before if you manage it right." He paused. "I want to run the south herd on the east side next fall. Rotate the pasture use differently than I have been." He glanced at her. "It's a change to the grazing schedule." "I'll update the ledger." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible in the cold afternoon, but she'd learned to read the small versions of his expressions over 3 months. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The county authority is going to be looking at land management in the Northwest Corridor more carefully now, after everything." He kept his eyes on the road. Webb mentioned there may be a formal position, someone to track supply records and land transactions for the small ranch operations in the region, flag irregularities before they become the kind of thing we just spent 2 months dealing with. Tessa was quiet. "He asked if I knew anyone suited to it," Colton said. She looked at the road ahead, the white hills, the pale sky going gold at the edge where the sun was getting low. She thought about the ledger on the kitchen table, the double-marked entries, the page she'd titled "Things That Don't Add Up." She thought about Cassie Farrell's sound in the gallery. She thought about the Dibble brothers, whose land had been bought at a price they'd probably been too desperate to argue about. "It would take me away from the ranch," she said. "Part-time. Maybe 1 week in 3. "I know," he said. "The accounts here would need to be maintained in my absence." "You could train Emmett," he said. "He's better with numbers than he lets on." She looked at him. He was looking at the road, driving, his expression neutral in the way that was not actually neutral, but was him being careful about something. "You want me to take it," she said. "I want you to do what you're built for," he said, "which is more than keeping one ranch's books in order." He paused. "You told me at the beginning you wouldn't spend every day proving you deserved to be here. I believed you then. I believe it more now." He glanced at her briefly. "This isn't about what the Valley thinks of you. It's about what you're capable of, which is considerably more than what you've been doing." It was the longest direct speech she'd heard him make about her specifically, and he said it the same way he said everything. Without ornament, without the performance of generosity, just the plain statement of what he observed to be true. She sat with it for a moment. The wagon moved through the white afternoon. "I'll speak to Webb," she said finally. He nodded, said nothing more. But his shoulders, which had been carrying a particular tension since before the hearing, settled slightly. But the valley thawed slowly, the way it always did. Not all at once, but in fits, patches of bare ground appearing through the snow in late February. The creek running fast and brown with snowmelt through March. The grass coming up tentatively in April, as if it wasn't sure yet whether winter had actually decided to leave. The east pasture came back the way Colton had said it would. The burned ground threw up new grass in early May, greener and denser than the sections that hadn't burned, the way cleared land sometimes does when it's been given a reason to start over. Tessa noticed it on a morning in the second week of May, riding the fence line on the gray mare she'd started using since January, when it had become apparent that her work for the county authority required more riding than she'd previously done in her life. She'd gotten better at it. Not natural. She would never be natural on horseback, but functional, which was what she needed. She stopped the mare at the northeast corner, the old cottonwood line, the fence post where she'd pushed through in the dark and the storm in December, and looked at the east pasture from a distance. From here you couldn't see the black marks anymore, just the grass, running even and green all the way to the ridge. She'd been to the county seat 4 times since January. She'd reviewed supply records for 6 ranch operations in the Northwest Corridor and flagged 2 irregularities that turned out, on investigation, to be simple accounting errors rather than anything deliberate. The 3rd trip she'd ridden with Webb to interview Cassie Farrell in person, to document her account of the representations made during the sale of her homestead. Cassie's property reversal was moving through the county authority with a speed that suggested the land board was sufficiently embarrassed by what had happened to want it resolved. The Dibble brothers' case was slower. There were complications with the secondary financing that Redstone Holdings had arranged for the purchase, and Crane's lawyer was fighting the reversal as part of a broader defensive strategy. It would likely be next year before that was resolved. Crane's criminal trial was scheduled for June. Tessa would testify again. She was ready. She'd been ready since December, and the additional months had only made her account more solid, more layered, more precisely articulated. Crane's lawyer had made an approach through intermediaries in March, delicately worded, nothing explicit, suggesting that a modification of certain testimony might be in everyone's interest. She'd written a response of 11 words. "Tell your client I have excellent notes and a good memory." Webb had found this funny enough to mention to his deputy. She turned the mare back toward the ranch house and rode slowly through the morning, thinking about the coming summer and what it would hold. The trial. The continued work for the county. The ledger at the kitchen table, which Emmett had taken over with a competence that had surprised no one who'd been paying attention. The south herd rotation that would move to the east pasture in September. A fence repair on the northwest boundary that she'd flagged in April and Dix had confirmed last week. The ordinary, accumulating life of a working ranch. She'd had no experience of this before October. She had not known, specifically, that she wanted it. But there was something in the dailiness of it, the records and the routines and the particular quiet of 2 people who understood each other moving through a shared space that answered something she hadn't known she'd been asking. The community gathering that summer was not the formal October event, but a smaller, practical meeting. The Valley Ranchers assembling at the community hall to discuss the water rights questions raised by the Redstone investigation and to determine how the corridor's water access would be managed going forward. Fletcher ran it, as he ran all official proceedings, with joyless efficiency. There were 14 ranchers in the room, which was almost the same number as the October gathering in a previous life that felt much further than 8 months away. Tessa sat beside Colton. She had not thought particularly about sitting beside him. It was simply where she sat, as naturally as the chair arrangement that had developed at the kitchen table, each of them on their own side, but close enough that the space between was not much of a space at all. Harlan Pruitt spoke first, which nobody had arranged, but everyone seemed to find appropriate. He was old and his operation was small, and he'd come close to selling in November, and everyone in the room knew all 3 of these things. He stood up with the careful effort of a man whose body costs him more than it used to, and said, without preamble, I want to say something before we get to water rights. Fletcher looked like he wanted to object, then didn't. I've been in this valley 31 years, Harlan said. I've seen things go wrong here, and I've seen things go right. What I know is that what went wrong this past year was something we didn't see because we were looking somewhere else. He paused. He did not look at Tessa directly, but the direction of what he was saying was not ambiguous. We had someone in this valley looking in the right place when none of the rest of us were, and the way we treated that person before we understood that was not good. He stopped, because he was not a man who spoke at length, and he'd already said more than was comfortable. That's all I wanted to say. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Mabel Grouse was in the gallery seats along the wall, not at the main table, because she was not a ranch operator, but present as she was always present where things were happening. Tessa did not look at her, but she was aware, in the peripheral way she was aware of most things, of the quality of the silence from that corner of the room. It was not an apology. It was a woman who had made her mind up about something and was discovering that the thing had turned out differently than she'd calculated, and was sitting with that in the particular way of people who find it difficult to change and difficult to pretend they don't need to. Tessa did not require anything from Mabel Grouse. She had stopped requiring things from that direction a long time ago. But she registered the silence because she registered everything. Fletcher cleared his throat and moved to the water rights discussion, and the meeting proceeded in the practical, unromantic way of valley business. Afterward, in the yard outside the hall, Ida Pruitt found her. Harlan doesn't say things like that in public, Ida said. In case you didn't realize. I realized, Tessa said. Ida looked at her with the direct, weathered gaze that Tessa had come to think of as the most honest face she'd seen regularly since coming to Red Hollow. How are you? She asked. Not socially, genuinely. Tessa thought about it, the way she'd thought about Colton asking the same question in December. The same honest process. Better than I expected to be, she said. Ida nodded slowly. You're staying, she said. Not a question. Yes. Good. Ida said it like a practical assessment. Then she walked back to where Harlan was talking to a rancher near the gate, and that was the entire conversation, and it was exactly enough. Colton found her a few minutes later, coming out of the hall with Fletcher, and they walked to the wagon together. The afternoon was warm, the first real warmth of a late spring day, and the valley was green in a way it wasn't always, the hills running with new grass all the way up to the ridge lines, where the cottonwoods were leafed out and moving. Water Rights Committee, Colton said as he climbed onto the wagon bench. Fletcher wants me on it. You should do it, she said. It's 3 meetings in the county seat this summer. I'll be in the county seat anyway. She took her side of the bench, settled her coat. We can ride together. He looked out at the road, the valley spreading below the hall in the afternoon light. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before he said something he'd been thinking about for a while. I want to expand the south herd, he said. 20 head in the fall if the grazing rotation holds. It'll mean another hired hand by winter. The accounts can support it, she said, if the fall market holds at last year's rate. You think it will? Close enough. She paused. I've been watching the Millhaven purchase reports for the past 3 months. The variance is within range. He turned and looked at her with the expression she'd learned to identify as the one he wore when something she said settled a question he'd been carrying. All right, he said. I'll write up the projections this week. He nodded. He picked up the reins. Patch, who had opinions about standing still and had been expressing them quietly for several minutes, moved forward with evident relief. They drove down from the hall toward the valley road, and the afternoon came with them, warm and unhurried, the kind of afternoon that makes no demands. Tessa sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and looked at the hills she'd looked at in October from a cold wagon driven by a man she didn't know yet, and thought about what it meant that she knew them differently now. Not because they'd changed, but because she'd stopped being a stranger to them. She had come to Red Hollow Valley in the back of a supply wagon with $11 and a canvas bag and a reputation she hadn't earned. She had been told she was wrong before she had the chance to be anything. She had been watched for disaster and blamed for weather and counted out by people who found it easier to repeat a story than to observe a person. And she had done what she always did, which was to keep her head down and her eyes open and her ledger current and her conclusions to herself until she was certain enough to speak. The thing that people who dismiss certain women never consider is what gets built in the silence they enforce. The observations, the patterns, the careful, patient accumulation of what is true as distinct from what is convenient. The women they decide don't count. Those women are still counting. They're counting everything. Tessa Hartwell had never stopped counting. And what she'd built in a valley that had written her off before she'd spoken a word had turned out to be the thing that held the valley together. She didn't think of it in those terms particularly. She was not given to self-mythology. She thought of it in the smaller terms she preferred: the ledger, the double-marked entries, the cold morning in the cottonwoods, the 11 words she'd sent to a lawyer who thought her testimony was negotiable, the satisfaction of a set of accounts that balanced, the east pasture coming back green after the burn. Colton drove, and the road ran out ahead of them, and Red Hollow Valley lay on either side in the long light of a May afternoon, all its roughness and its practicality and its difficult, complicated life going on the way it always had, with more trouble in it than anyone planned for and more resilience than anyone gave it credit for. Tessa watched the road. She had no idea what was coming next, which was true of everyone in every valley in every season, regardless of how much they pretended otherwise. But she had the ledger. She had the accounts. She had 11 months of knowing this land and these people and this man beside her who had looked at a room full of better options by all conventional measures and written her name in the book. And she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, at some cost, that being the wrong choice in someone else's story did not make you wrong. It made you in the wrong story. She'd found the right one. The wagon turned onto the northwest road, toward the Double R, toward the green hills and the new grass and the ordinary, unglamorous, irreplaceable life waiting there, and Tessa Hartwell settled into her seat and rode toward home.